Not around. It's okay. All right. So over to you, Henry.
Right. Yeah, I got the whole floor.
You got the whole floor. Yep.
I have a couple in engaging my. How do I increase the angelic, my relationship with the angelic? I've been aware of them at different times. Sometimes I'm profoundly aware of them. I've had a taste of a lot of different encounters with them, but consistently I haven't been able to really engage consciously and purposely on a daily basis, and which I would be my desire.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it started with engaging with my own personal angels and then assigning them and interacting with them on a basis of them being involved in my everyday life. So I got used to, them, sending them ahead of my day, preparing interactions with people, making connections in the heavens, just the things that I start to legislate every day and begin to rule. I just include them in it and talk to them and assign them, and just keep it an active relationship, really, which is very much about us. They're there to minister to us, so we just need to direct them to serve effectively. So that side of it is really down to us, and we can actively do that every day. Once what do we know, what we see the Father doing, then we want them involved in helping us fulfill seeing what the Father's doing. So using that interaction around us to do that. The other way of engaging is to go to the court of angels. So if you have a mandate for something, go to the court of angels, present the mandate, and see who would be volunteering to be involved with that mandate. So again, if any comes forward, then you can then assign them, direct them into that. So that's another way in which we can be proactive about engaging. The other area really is where when God's on the throne of our life and we're on our mountain throne, then the canopy of angels is around us. And it's like going up into those different layers and seeing what goes on and sort of connecting with them. And then you become more familiar with what they do and the areas of responsibility that they have. And then when you get something like a mandate for something, then you know which canopy to call on. So you can call them from your throne and then again assign them and direct them. So all that really is sort of our proactive approach. Sometimes, obviously, we go into a court or we go into a place and they are there and they have a function which isn't directly engaged with us. They have a heavenly host function or a governmental function as regards to the particular court that they're involved with, or they can be messengers that God sends to us with a message. And our interaction with them generally is, okay, what's the message? Yeah. So we're really not so interested in them, but the message that they brought. There's another interaction there. But that's obviously if God sends them with a message. Obviously, when we engage in corporate worship settings or gatherings, then it's tuning into the angelic atmosphere around us to see what's going on, whether portals are open. Some of the chaos or the living creatures, we may get the fiery swords or the golden ladders or the whirlwinds or fiery pillars, that type of thing, who come and engage with us. Also, if you're part of an ecclesia, then you have the angel of the ecclesia, or the angels. We have 2 or 3 that are assigned here. Again, you can interact with them in terms of preparing for the meetings, opening up the heavens, calling in maybe the gathering angels or the healing angels that would come and stir the healing waters. again, depending on what it was that you were mandated or authorized to do, would be determined by what sort of angels you would engage with. But all that pretty much is, again, it's our sphere of government, so we can actually interact with that angelic realm. Because it's our responsibility, and they recognize that, and they will get involved. It's when they turn up without any of our involvement, then it's almost like, okay, why are you here? What you come with? Have you got anything to give us? Have you brought a power orb type thing? That's really sort of almost like our communication. We're talking to them and finding out what they're here for. It's like we have our 4 angels, the 4 order angels that are involved in transition, wind of change and sound of many waters, refiners, fire, and transformation. So we engage with them actively when we gather for their outworking of what they're called to do. And sometimes they turn up differently. The transformation angel often, all 4 of them often have a heralding sort of trumpet in which they are heralding a sound, a call for transformation, for change, for coming into a new identity and position. But often I've seen, well, not often, but a few times I've seen transformation have a big axe, and seems to be that he wants to break change and sever people's tethers or connections so that they can be released to go further. Several times that's happened. Once I see that, then usually I'll wait to see if anyone else is going to engage with it and share it or bring it out. If no one does that, sometimes I'll do it and then just encourage people to participate. It's actually, this angel's here today with an axe. Anyone feel they've got any chains? Anyone feel they need anything set and free from? Then, hey, come and engage. Come and stand in the space and engage with that particular angel. Same with refiner's fire. It's like I always know if there's a need for refining fire purification, then can go engage. Also, we can go to the temple and engage with the seraphim, the burning ones who are often engaged with the altar that's there, the burning coals and that type of stuff. I don't tend to mess with any of them unless I have to. It's like, some of them are quite imposing characters, aren't they? They're sort of like, the sort of Kashmalim are very much, they're sort of floaty, colored ribbon, sort of in gentle worshippers who come around us and just love our worship and stuff around us. But the seraphim, they're, to me, they're the ones that you're undone by if you happen to engage them and they engage you. They're not sort of I have invited them to come before. I tend to more do an invite rather than a order with those guys,
Right.
But hey,
I was in the father's house, and he has there's like a fireplace, and I've got a fireplace. I've got a couple of fireplaces in a couple of places too. But in his, there were some seraphim angels in his fireplace, and so I was over standing there talking to him. Well, I was in between their line of vision and him, and they spoke to me and told me, "Hey, get out of the way! You're blocking our view." And, it kind of freaked me out a little bit, and I kind of looked over there, and I thought, "Oh, he's got seraphim angels. Seraphim, they're like in his fireplace." Well, I've actually never engaged them in there. It always kind of freaked me out a little bit. It's like ever since then I've been kind of aware that they're there. But while we're talking this morning, I'm thinking, maybe I should have, since they at least let themselves be known, maybe gone and tried to engage them there in that place. But it was kind of a funny experience because told me to get out of the way.
I mean, Jesus said, that the Father would release to him, 12 legions of angels to minister to him. And obviously they did minister to him in wilderness, in the garden. I think there is the sort of the angelic host who are there really for God. I mean, they're there for God's business. They're there, they're not so much there ministering to us. They're ministering on behalf of God, and that sometimes engages us.
Yeah.
And we had when we were going through the period of the gathering angels, that whole gathering period where God began to look to gather and remove stumbling blocks. It was a period of intense, where God was really intensely looking at us, because we had come into a place of intimacy. We were asking for more, and that's a period where the stumbling blocks were getting unveiled and the whole transformation thing was really kicking off. We had the gathering angels. They would come and they would stand around the room almost like on sentry watch, waiting for an opportunity to go in and remove something or gather something out, and that it was about gathering stumbling blocks and lawlessness out of the kingdom. And they were quite stern. They didn't look like they were there for fun. They were stern. They were almost like guards. They were very upright, really sort of like, ooh, you want to make sure you know the love of God when you engage them, but we did, some people did. I did, definitely. I invited them to come and gather and remove the stumbling blocks. I don't want anything in the way, and they were assigned to do that. There was a clear period of angelic assignment where God wanted to remove the stumbling, and still does. I mean, it's not ended. For those who've never embraced it, it's still available. So those were pretty interesting beings, in that sense. So yeah, I think we've had quite a lot. I remember we had who was it? Larry Pearson, who's a guy who came out of Toronto. I think he's sort of quite a prophetic guy, and he came here one night and he prophesied really that we were an angelic landing strip, and angels felt at home to come here and stuff. So we've taken that seriously, and we've always made them welcome. Our focus obviously isn't on the angelic because it's on God, but God sends them and God uses them, and God wants us to be aware of them. I think a lot of people just get this sort of mixed up with this. Oh, well, we don't want to worship angels. Well, of course not. Why would we want to worship angels? They're made lower than us, so we don't want to worship them. In fact, we have to learn how to judge them. I think one of the other things that I remember talking to Pamela Green Jones, and she basically judges them in a way of reward and thanks them for their involvement and their activity and what they're doing. And they seem to like that. They seem to like us, honoring them in the right way. Not they're not God, but they have a role to play. And when they do, it's good to acknowledge it. And so she found that attracted them around her life when she spent time thanking them and being appreciative for what they were doing.
That's good. Yeah.
So that was I'd never really thought about that, and she was like, almost like rewarding them and giving them that sort of thanks that made them feel appreciated. I mean, everyone likes to feel appreciated, I guess, and I suppose they're no different. So she found that a lot more activity took place because of her attitude towards them, which they seemed to respond to. So yeah, that was another occasion. I think I remember talking to her about it. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting subject in the sense, we're just starting to scratch the surface of it. There's a lot more angels than there are people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of them. And if I guess if you think that Jesus had 12 legions at his command, then every believer will also have 12 legions at his command. So every believer has at least 12 legions. So that's, I don't know how many a legion was. I think it was thousands. So, let's say a minimum 12,000. So that's quite a lot when you add up a billion Christians who have 12 legions. Plus, we've all got a couple of guardian ones, and we've all got one assigned to us in heaven, and it adds up. There's quite a few that are connected with us that I guess it would be useful to make sure that we are aware of.
I notice their activity around me when I first wake up in the morning. There's seems to be quite a bit of, I can kind of hear them early in the morning. They kind of help me. It almost seems like they're getting me started, help me kind of get started in the morning. What I'd like to do is be able to kind of continue that engagement on throughout the day, because sometimes in the morning it's quite clear, but I haven't always been sure of what it was that was speaking to me. And so over the years, I've had quite a struggle with this, is this the enemy or is this not, it's like, and so that's kind of always been the line that I've kind of had to walk is, discerning, what I had around me.
Yeah.
And this morning I was kind of experiencing a little bit and trying to express my desire, for more of a relationship and stuff, but it's.
Yeah. I say some of it is, starting with your own that are with you, and then you've got a starting point for their engagement. I think obviously a lot of people are quite fearful in that, okay, am I going to be deceived? Are they going to be masquerading like that? I tend to find that they I don't tend to have any problem with the demonic realm in that sense, but the angels that I sense their sort of fragrance. They've got a good fragrance with them. There's something you just pick up, and I think those that don't ever seem to come with a good fragrance. There's always something that's a bit off, and I sort of think that's not quite right, But I can't say that, I've never really had that much involvement with the other side of it, really. So I've never really been that interested in that side of it. Did quite a lot of deliverance and inner healing ministry years ago, so I was used to casting them out. But once you cast them out, you just get rid of them. Yeah. Hiya, George.
Hey, good morning. Sorry I'm late.
That's all right. Come and join us. You can make a 3. We have a bench of 3 now. Now we have government. So, we've been talking about the angelic realm, really, and how we can be more proactively engaging with them and looking to see their involvement in our lives from those that are already assigned to us, and sometimes those that God sends to us with particular messages or particular things that he wants done, assignments perhaps, that we can begin to tune into. But, so.
I just happened to have a service Sunday, and that was some of my subject. I didn't teach on it, just because I'm involved now more than I ever have been. It pops out, but it's so interesting. This charismatic church is so typical of no understanding at all.
Okay.
Yeah. It's almost scary. They're scared. They're afraid of it, actually, and yet they have a background. And we all believe in angels, theologically, but not experientially, of course.
Well, that's right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I find that more traditional um, churches tend to have more of an acceptance of the angelic than necessarily some of the more Pentecostal type churches, who almost like the gifts of the Spirit were their focus and didn't really connect up too much with the sort of the other angelic type things that were part of it. Whereas some of the more traditional churches that we have don't seem to have a problem, because some of their liturgy actually has angels mentioned in it, and there's almost an assumption that, well, the angels will be watching what we're doing, type of thing. Um, I mean, going back into my charismatic days, years ago, I saw an angel once. We had an angel turn up in our meeting physically one day, and so I mean a really big one, and some people were like, whoa, freaked right out by it. But there was very little, interaction or even thought about it. It was like, just the stories of angels sort of showing up sometimes in people's cars and that type of thing, and hitchhikers, and the stories you get, that we heard, but not. Don't think we didn't even have a theology around the angelic at all. It just wasn't something that was on our radar, even though we were very involved in the supernatural in terms of spiritual gifts type of stuff and ministry and everything like that. The angelic wasn't something that I don't think I ever heard anyone really talk about. I never talked about it, and as a church, we never really even thought about it, to be honest. So things have changed quite a lot over the years. I think it was when I started personally engaging with my angels, and then I started sharing that with people and saying, hey, you can engage with yours, then the whole thing started to sort of have some activity with it, But I was saying to Henry earlier, we had a guy came here and he sort of carried a prophetic gift, and he prophesied that we were an angelic landing strip, and angels liked coming here. So I was like, okay. And that when someone says something like that, then I'm sort of always curious, well, what does that mean? How do we interact then? What do we look out for? What do we do to to in a sense appreciate their engagement? I think, rather than ignore them.
That seems to be happening to me in that I'm opening up or stirring up or being a gateway. The places that I'm going, there's individuals that are coming in. And I was at a pastor's conference. I taught one night, spoke a little bit on some of the experiences. And in the service that night, one of the pastor's wives had 4 big angels come up and stand next to her. Never happened to her before. And then there's another guy in Southern Oregon, the same thing. I told him, I said, have you ever talked to your angel? Because he had an angel keep appearing to him or coming up to him, and finally he did, and since then he's just broke it wide open. So it seems to be, once we have that experience, if we seem to be an open door, don't we, an open gateway?
Yeah, I think if you look at the thing with Jacob and the ladder on earth engaging heaven, open heaven, Jesus or the Lord standing in the doorway, and then you have the angels ascending and descending, you see that sort of interaction around an open heaven and a gateway, is something that we should expect. I think the expecting it is something that then you can sort of look for in that sense. And I think that that I think is really where we never even thought about it like that. But it's obviously there in Scripture. When you look at that type of thing, angels are involved, And if we are a gateway, and as you say, we open portals, or our lives are a sense for heaven to engage people around us, and we have a flow from inside out, then we should absolutely expect the angelic realm to be active around our lives. And it's just, what do you do with them then? I think that's the key. What happens? What do you do with them? I think some of them are obviously there for us, are assigned to us. We're supposed to direct them, and they're supposed to minister on our behalf. Some of them are sent by God with a message or with something particular to minister. We've had angels turned up with swords and crowns and all sorts of different things to give away to people, scepters and mantles. I think I've seen the angelic realm in the mantle room in heaven very, very active in terms of releasing mantles and engaging. I think expecting them to touch people in dreams and to bring angelic encounters when people are sleeping, who maybe not as open when they're awake. I think there's another thing that angels do. You have a number of things. Even Jacob with Bethel, it was like seen as a dream. In the vision that he had. So I'm one of the things I do a lot is to send angels out to engage people in their dreams, and to unveil something new in an experience for them, so that they will begin to be drawn after that supernatural sense of God's kingdom and the heavenly experiences that we can engage in. So, yeah.
I was in Poland several years ago and went to the church, the traditional church there. I forget the name of the historic church, with the church buildings all decorated there. The whole insides are decorated with paintings, the dome ceilings, but they're just filled with angels, these paintings. So they must have, you were reflecting back a minute ago, they must have a history like the Catholics. We went into Mexico in the 70s, and they were more open to the supernatural than the American Pentecostals, when they just push forward to be touched by God.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there does seem to be a more of a history of sort of the saints and the sort of mystics and the sort of angelic, that they're less closed to that. I think there was definitely an sort of enemy assignment to try and stop our engagement. I think introducing certain theologies, I think Ian Clayton talks about that there was in the Dark Ages, that they were forbidden to talk about any angels' names who weren't those mentioned in the Bible, and you aren't going to get too many names other Michael and Gabriel. There aren't too many others who are actually mentioned in our version of the Bible. Obviously, you have their names, which are their generic names in the Hebrew. So the Chaos and the Ophnim, Seraphim, Cherubim, they're sort of, the orders are mentioned quite a lot, but individual names not so much. And I think that set a pattern that almost became this sort of religious spirit thing that hindered any sort of real interaction with the angelic realm. But we're missing out on so much help, if we don't. It's so much of what the angelic realm does is in realms that we're not really. I mean, I wouldn't go into the atmosphere and the earth and try and deal with principalities and powers and all that stuff. For me, that's the angelic role, and I assign them to do that sort of thing. And if you can't do that, then you're, in a sense, always going to operate beneath that and therefore be under it, which is not a good place to be when you're trying to deal with something. So, yeah. Okay. All right. So, any other things? Anyone else got anything they want to share or talk about today?
I happened to come across a fellow that seems to be interacting or maybe traveling a little bit with Ian Clayton by the name of Dr. O.
All right. Yeah.
Um, I've listened to some of his YouTube teaching.
Mm.
Obviously, being with Clayton, he's in the circle of trust, so to speak. Boy, he's an interesting fellow with his Hebrew background and his he seems to speak fluent Hebrew, at least in spots he does, where he reads things or something. Have you had much interaction with him, or at least have you heard him much?
I've met him, and I've communicated a little bit with each other on occasion. I think a lot of what Ian Clayton got came from Dr. O. It's that way round rather than the other way round. I know they've ministered together, but a lot of Ian's understanding of the Hebrew, and particularly the four faces of God and the different aspects of the Yod Hey Vav Hey type thing, that came definitely through Dr. O, and others. So I find the style is a little bit interesting. He came to actually one of the sessions I was teaching down in San Diego. He actually turned up, so he sat in for a couple of sessions and we had a chat. And I think he's Nigerian background. His wife is a Methodist minister, so the church that they're operating in Venice, California, is a Methodist sort of thing. I don't really have anything negative to say. I think sometimes it can come over a little bit sort of by rote. You can access if you do this or say this or whatever. I find it a little bit like that, but then that might just be trying to help people engage initially. He gave me a couple of his books that I've had a read of. Now it's quite interesting stuff. I tend to find that a lot of it isn't very legislative, so it's very interesting and very revealing of revelatory, but not so much as in, well, what do you do with this? So there's a lot of he's written a book on the realms of heaven, and there are all these different sorts of interactions with the different realms of heaven, but it doesn't really then, well, what do you do? What am I supposed to do there? How am I supposed to engage there? So I think he's pretty much got a good solid background. I wouldn't be doubting the guy, but again, we all got different things that I suppose we're supposed to bring, and he's got a particular flavor to his stuff, which I got to be honest, I don't have an awful lot of time to be able to listen to a lot of other people's stuff. I spend most of my time engaging God and developing the stuff that I need to teach others. So I haven't spent a lot of time going through his stuff. But he's got stuff on the the letters and interesting. Some of it's very interesting. I just haven't listened to it enough, I guess, to get into what the point is, and is there a legislative point that comes out of what he brings, or is he still just opening up the revelatory realm, and that will come later perhaps. And I think a lot of people do that. Their mission is almost to open up the revelatory, and then perhaps later it will become more practical in terms of how we're supposed to function in it as children of God, rather than just the experiences. I know he's talked a lot about different dimensions and different things that he's engaged in, which sounds very interesting. But yeah,
Thank you.
Seems a good guy. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions? Testimonies? Things to share?
They say silence is golden. One of the most difficult things you have in a traditional Pentecostal church in the early days was to have silence. As soon as you got silence, somebody wanted to give a message in tongues. That was the background I come out of.
Yeah, I mean, my background is out of nothing really. I mean, I was brought up in the Methodist church. I was sent to Sunday school, and got sort of saved there. It was a very evangelical church, always preaching the gospel. Never heard anything about the Holy Spirit there whatsoever. Then sort of when I got a bit in my teenage years, I felt almost sort of I was challenged in terms of the Word of God, and then we had the Methodist Church who were starting to adopt certain things that I just thought, I'm not sure about that, and then I sort of met my wife, and she was going to another church, so I had a very strong drawing to go to that church, let's say, for a while, which was the Brethren Church, so that was like even less obviously Holy Spirit inspired, but I learned a lot about engaging God in communion and different things there. But I got baptized in the Spirit while I was in there in the Brethren Church, which was somewhat a shock to them, I think, once I shared it. Very interesting. I was like, we used to have what was called open meetings, where we didn't have a preacher, and we just would go and sit and wait until someone felt they wanted to go and share something. So one Sunday night, we were sat there, and it was one of those you felt God was nudging you and then starting to kick you and get up and share something. And it was like, so I got up and I shared what happened to me in getting baptized in the Spirit and my testimony. And it was like silence. I mean, it was like you could have heard a pin drop. It was just absolutely silent, and they were just like, oh, okay. And I was on the way, I was going out, and this old guy in his 80s, he shook my hand. He said, "It's all right, boy." He said, "Yeah, I experienced that too." He said, "Don't let them put you off." So it's just like, but even in that place, I mean, I can remember, seeking for the baptism of the Holy Spirit and not having anybody who'd ever knew anyone who experienced it for about 3 years. And I started teaching, I was running youth groups and different things, and I started teaching young people about it and actually, praying for them to get baptized in the Spirit. And some of them got baptized in the Spirit before I did. It was just like, didn't seem very fair, but, I've always been one who's, kept that stuff until I get it. And eventually I experienced that, and that sort of opened up a whole new realm. Suffice it to say, I didn't stay in the Brethren Church for that much longer afterwards, but I did get a few invitations to go around and share some of what was going on before I left, which was great. And I still got a lot of friends and contacts from those early days where we were experiencing some of these things.
We had our resistance when we came into the gifts of the Spirit. Pentecost, of course, encouraged everybody to be baptized. That wasn't in the Spirit and speak in tongues. But when we begin to come into the gifts of the Spirit, and probably for my dad, it was about early 60s, mid 60s. And that's when the hackles begin to rise on the traditional Pentecost. And we got our started getting our cold shoulders, and I was a Pentecostal evangelist with some, well, local success in our little world. But boy, when I stepped into the gifts in the 60, mid 60s, I started having doors shut, and they cut me off. And yeah, same elder brother,
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I mean, yeah, because I've no real history with Pentecostal churches at all. I mean, I was, once I got baptized in the Spirit, very quickly started a charismatic group, I guess, who the gifts of the Spirit were just, well, it was just totally integral. You didn't think of the baptism of the Spirit being separate from the gifts of the Spirit. It was just, that's how it was. But then we didn't have any Pentecostal churches in our area whatsoever. We didn't even have any Baptist churches in our area. So we were pretty back on the on the pecking order of anything. It's like we were at the bottom of the rung, really. So even to get baptized in water, I had to go 12 miles up the road to find a church that taught baptism in water, because we just didn't have anything like that whatsoever. So when I did get baptized in the Spirit, I didn't know anything. I didn't have any sort of knowledge of what was and wasn't acceptable. It was just like I experienced it and started flowing in the gifts of the Spirit and all those type of things. But I can remember, my having the experience. My baptism in the Spirit was pretty much on love, really. It was a powerful encounter with the love of God, which did open up the gift of tongues. I had another encounter with God, which opened up the sort of the power dimension to it. I started to have pictures and things like that, but the power dimension of it, that came later. I mean, it's my testimony of my egg sandwich testimony. It was like, I was in a meeting with a group of people, men. I think it was men, all men. And we were just engaging and worshiping together, and I had this vision right in front of me, like with my eyes open, of an egg sandwich, which was, I mean, I was looking around thinking, well, this is weird, hoping no one was going to think I was weird. And I hate egg sandwiches. I mean, I really don't like egg sandwiches. That would be one of the last things I'd want to eat. And God said, are you willing to eat it? And I'm like, oof. And I mean, it wasn't any explanation, just I knew it was God, and it was just this invitation, eat it. So I ate it. I mean, I felt the most embarrassed I think I'd ever felt. I mean, I took this thing and started eating it, and I was so hoping everyone else's eyes were closed and they weren't watching what I was doing. But I ate it, and it was like, and it's almost tasted, as I was doing this. It was such a real encounter. And then another one appeared. And God said, "You willing to have another one?" So, well, even for a penny, even for a pound. So I had it, and as soon as I finished it, and this vision disappeared, it's like the power of God just hit me. I mean, like electricity. It was like a lightning bolt, and I was just absolutely charged with energy, and I didn't know what to do with it. So it was just like, oh, okay, I'll start touching people. Well, they started within a minute or so, the whole room was totally polaxed. They were all flat, and I started prophesying over them all, calling things out. I mean, it was just like this amazing sort of thing. And I went through 3 or 4 years where anyone who wanted to get baptized in the Spirit, they just came and saw me, and it was just like, bang, the power of God would just really hit them. And it just happened. It was not something I knew was going to happen, or tried. Or I wasn't even asking God for anything. I was just really enjoying the wonderful sense of His intimacy and love. I wasn't really sort of thinking about power, but that whole dimension of the power of God and then the gifts really started to come. And then all the deliverance stuff started after that. I started laying hands on people, and they start manifesting on the floor. Sort of slithering around and stuff, and I'm like, what's this? First time it happened was a friend of mine. I mean, really a good friend of mine, and I was praying for him, and he ended up on the floor slithering around like a snake, and I was just so shocked. I mean, I did not know what to do. I'm just like, oh, what is this? So it's like, oh, okay, well, I don't know what to do with it. So I sort of shook him and got him up. Said, look, what on earth was going on? He said, I don't know. I said, well, do you know you were doing this? And he said, no. So I said, well, I think we need to pray for you. So we that evening we arranged to pray with him. Three of us went round, started praying with him. Immediately he's on the floor, he's slithering, then he starts sort of making these noises at us. So we sort of think, okay, we've got to deliver him. He needs deliverance. So we started at this thing. You know, we tried everything we knew. I mean, I'd never cast a demon out of anyone up to that point. Never even seen a demon, really. Not like that. Sort of started, you know, doing what the Bible said. You know, come out. You know, in Jesus' name, come out. It's like, you know, we were getting at this thing for about an hour. You know, it was just, you know, not getting anywhere. And then I remembered, whoa, so we suddenly thought, you know, Legion, this guy must have a legion of stuff in him, because it's like, it's not coming out. So eventually we sort of say to him, you know, well, what's your name? You know, and eventually we found out what this thing was, you know, and it took us about an hour, or more, no, more than like 2 hours to get this thing. And eventually there was deliverance. He came free, and we started praying for him, thinking, oh, great, we'll just see him filled up with God. And then he started manifesting something else, you know, and then we're like, okay. So having had success with one, we then went for it. And he got delivered of 2 or 3 things. And the last thing he got delivered of was stubbornness. So we learned, well, actually, we should have got that one first. You know, it would have been probably easier if we had that one first and got the rest. But we were like, I mean, it was comical, literally. I mean, absolutely comical, because we didn't know anything. You know, I've never seen anything. We just sort of flew by the seat of our pants, but we learned really quickly, you know. And I can remember one of the guys there, he'd read a Smith Wigglesworth books where Smith Wigglesworth had punched someone in the stomach, so he had a go at that. I mean, so it was the most hilarious thing, you know, when I think of it, you know, how green we were, just had a go. But at the end of the day, we were ecstatic that this guy had some deliverance, and then all of a sudden, mayhem in the church. It's just like every demon that was there just started coming to the surface and manifesting. Mostly, and in my wife particularly, it was just like all of a sudden everything started to manifest. So I learned most of my deliverance on my wife, because it's like she had one of everything. It seemed to be, she had a full set of everything. You know, she had all this religious background, and she had I don't know how many religious spirits. I mean, she had basically everything going. So I learned a lot just practicing on her, and this went on for like several years, and I'd never had any deliverance whatsoever. No, I never manifested anything. I mean, I used to think, well, I'm sure I couldn't. I mean, everyone's manifesting demons. It's like, what on earth's going on? You know, but I learned, you know, by ministering to others, and eventually, it all opened up in me, and I ended up getting delivered of lots of things, and learned really quickly how to cooperate with getting set free. But you know, it was very interesting days, but just totally had to learn. You know, then I sort of found a book. Was it Pigs in the Parlor? I don't know if you ever read the book Pigs in the Parlor. I read that and I thought, flip, I wish I'd had this 5 years ago. This is everything we've just gone through in the last 5 years. You know, but to be honest, now we just don't see any manifestations of the demonic. They just go. Where we have so much of a higher level of authority in what we're doing, we just don't give them any room to manifest. We don't give them any room to start distracting people from worship, you know, causing any sort of taking people's dignity while they're getting delivered. And yeah, because some people, there was terrible manifestations of stuff. Some of the people, you know, and people were enjoying it almost, because it was like, yeah, look at this, you know. And it was like, we just don't get that now. You know, we see people set free all the time, but it's because, you know, they know that we know our authority, and they don't step outside of it. Very rarely do we ever get anything like that anymore, because we've just grown and we know our authority, and that we have a higher level of authority when we're operating in stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great picture, great story. Thank you.
Hey, Mike, while you're talking about demons,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
there's been I've come across a couple of words, and I think they're kind of going along some of the things that we talk about, but they're using the words disassociation and fragmentation.
Yeah.
And what role do I guess fighting those things do the courts play, or is it just more of identifying those and then dealing with those through the redemptive process of the blood of Christ?
We sort of engaged that stuff years ago when we sort of came across some satanic ritual abuse and some instances of pretty heavy dissociation of, ended up talking to the child that was hidden and those sorts of things. And at that stage, all we knew really was to lead the person through forgiveness and minister to them, and then, saw them in a sense have a measure of healing. Recently, in the whole lie busting ministry, they do a reintegration of parts, seeing it as people stuck at particular ages where trauma has taken place in their lives, so they're emotionally stuck at particular years. And one of the parts of that ministry is to ask God to reveal if there are any stuck parts, and the person gets an age, or and again looking to reintegrate them back into wholeness, into Jesus. We've certainly used the courts to deal with any legal rights that those things have to be there, in a sense. But generally, we've used lie busting more than anything else. Just asking Jesus to bring that person, give them a vision of either walking back into Him or coming back into, the adult person, so that they can be made whole. I think a lot of people have had trauma or abuse in some way which has stunted their emotional development, and at the real heavy end of that, then it would be, multiple personality disorder, where you actually are talking to like another person, a different voice, a different personality type, simply because of the burying that through, to hide it, to essentially mask the pain or the trauma that's hidden there. I think, what for me, it obviously isn't a demon that's there. It's the person's own personality which is fragmenting because of, trauma, and so we tend to use, more of a healing approach rather than a judicial approach. When it's a demonic thing like a familiar spirit that's affecting somebody, then we tend to use the courts to identify the legal right that it has to be there generationally or within the person, and then repentance and deliverance can take place. But it's very, very lacking in manifestation, because they just seem to know the authority now and go. Once someone has got the legal right and the verdict, they have to go, rather than spending all that time telling them to get out. They know that the verdict is been given and the judge has given that verdict, and they have to go. Now, they'll still try and fool people into coming back if they can, or operate from the outside and still try and trick people into thinking they still got some sort of control in their lives. But take captive every thought, and make sure you don't give in to any of the mindsets and thought patterns that they have used to get us down patterns of spirals of behavior. So yeah, I think in our experience we've much more used the sort of more reintegrating of an approach of the person, for those type of things. But of course there could be familiar things that are behind them, that if someone isn't free. I mean, there's lots of different things out there. I know there's quite a large a lot of people who are engaging with the teaching that Arthur Burke has on alien human spirit. There's sort of quite a lot of people seem to be ministering to a lot of people who've had every sort of deliverance and yet don't seem to be free. And he's come up with this teaching, and he has some empirical evidence up on the back of it when they've done studies in terms of what goes on in people's brains and stuff, that there seems to be something that's there that just doesn't belong there. But I've not gone into that teaching myself. I have talked to a few people who are ministering it, and they seem to be having some very good results, although we've not really come across that particularly here. So I think there's a lot of different ways that those sort of things take place, and the main thing is someone becomes whole and brought back into their rightful condition. And I think communion and taking communion to bring that restoration and bring people back is also part of that, I think. So the whole communion thing can definitely go alongside deliverance and healing to bring wholeness, particularly if there are genetic things that need dealing with as well that go with some of these things. A lot of epigenetic things can be set up in people as a result of trauma, which we don't want passed to another generation. So, yeah. Have you come across much of that yourself, or in sort of ministering to people?
No, I have not as of yet. I haven't been as aware of it. I guess, to be looking for it. Do you know what I mean? I've always kind of just gone to having somebody deal with the forgiveness issue if they, had something happen to them, and it's been more on like a surface level, not necessarily identifying that as an individual that I'm dealing with, even though I know that they're stuck in time somewhat when they engage with those heart thoughts of that incident or how they feel about the person. But I was listening to a couple of different individuals, and there's actually some evidence now that even some different implantations have been taking place in individuals, and whether they were fully abducted or whatever, but they're finding things, and that even these items that they're putting in people, certain implants, are starting to affect their, I guess you could call it their wholeness as a person.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very interesting field, and I think a lot of people, I think most of us have had some sort of mild form of immaturity in certain emotional areas in our lives that we talk about emotional healing and restoration of that in different ways. Obviously, there are some which are very severe manifestations of that, which do cause multiple personality and other sort of issues. But I know God can set people free no matter what it is that has happened, and whatever the enemy's done. I think it's just seemingly different revelation that's being released to help people deal with some of those things. It's certainly not our major focus anymore, but we do minister lie busting, and we expect, dealing with people who are coming from an addictive background and stuff that, within our rehabilitation unit, probably 75-80% have suffered some sort of abuse, which is, traumatic, and they're covering up using substances to mask it or to take away the pain or various other things. And it can be very difficult for them when they have to face it, because they've spent so many years avoiding it, and we're then encouraging them to face the things that they're have been covering up, and it can be very difficult. And and for people who haven't ever dealt with the emotions of those things, forgiveness can be very difficult for them in terms of when they've been abused and the effects of that abuse. But we've seen a lot of good results of people getting set free and coming into wholeness and being completely reintegrated back into normal life. Um, uh, but yeah,
Yeah,
not easy
forgiveness
for
is
a lot
all.
of people. So.
Forgiveness has always been the key that I've tried to always get people to focus on, because biblically speaking, you have the strong illustrations that it's like putting yourself in torture when
Yeah.
you have this unforgiveness. And it seems to be the almost the doorway for other things to kind of come in and have a legal right.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even Ephesians, where it talks about don't let the sun go down of your anger, otherwise you give the devil a place or a room or a landing place. It's like don't sleep with the enemy. That's one of our phrases that we've used a lot. Don't sleep with the enemy. Don't go to bed having not dealt with something, because you're opening yourself up. And forgiveness is the key things. We have a teaching called Forgive and Release. So it's not just actually forgiving somebody, but according to Matthew 18, releasing them from the debt. And the debt can be a whole lifetime of stuff as a result of what's happened to them in the past, in their childhood or whatever. When we often find that it isn't the people who are angry and hatred or whatever. It's almost easier for them to see what they need to forgive, even though it might be very difficult to forgive. There are a lot of people who just think it's normal the way they are, and then when you point out, well, actually, you didn't get this and you didn't get that, and this shouldn't have happened to you, they're like, oh, and they don't have an emotion almost attached to it, that you almost have to help them to see, look, you're owed. This is a huge debt outstanding in your life. You're owed. And a lot of people, when it comes to their parents, they don't like to apportion any sort of thing to their parents, so we find it quite difficult to make a connection. Those who are angry, it's almost easier. Hey, you're angry. To deal with this anger, you need to let it go. You need to forgive. You need to release the person. But there's a whole lot of people who don't even know they're in unforgiveness. They don't even realize that they had anything to forgive. But emotionally, they clearly are affected by what some people have done. So, we do tend to focus on forgiveness, and we have a foundational teaching. My wife does, which actually we've not that recently put out. She's been doing a set of foundational teaching that in our alternative Sunday gathering. So I do sort of the engaging God stuff, and she's doing the more foundational stuff for people who are not at that point yet of engaging God at that level, which we find is quite effective. And forgiveness is a key part of that in every area. So, yeah.
There's a fellow from your part of the world I ran across some time ago by the name of Dr. Kenneth McCall. Have you ever seen any of his books? He's a medical doctor that turned priest in the Anglican, I think. Anyway, his main connection is the Eucharist, and he's had some incredible deliverances from this type of thing. It was just an interesting. I think the book is still on Amazon, but it was printed in the 70s. But it's quite a interesting insight into that slice of deliverance through the Eucharist, where they gather and a lot of forgiveness, and then even people that were dead, are released. And
No, never come across that myself, but I'm sure there's so much out there, isn't there? Really.
Yeah, really is.
The enemy's got a lot of activity, and God is obviously countering that with a lot of revelation and truth to enable to bring people into freedom.
Exactly.
So. Anyway, okay, all right. Well, we'll leave it there.